Okay, we are live.
So welcome all of you to this session, which is a part of the workshop that is co-terminus with a project titled Recovery with Dignity. This is a project which is being implemented by two institutions, Indian Institute for Human Settlements and University of East Anglia, Norwich, UK. It has been a 3-year-long process, a 3-year-long project, and it's a fascinating project. And I'm sure some of you must have joined other sessions while this project, while the project findings were disseminated and engaged. And there are some more sessions today and tomorrow. I hope many of you are part of that. This is kind of not a very different activity, but linked to what the project set out to investigate or examine. This is also about a book that is recently being published. So we'll be launching formally this book along with some of the major contributors that made this book possible. This book actually responds to a lot of questions that have been asked in this project, Recovery with Dignity. Because at the back of the book is a project which one of the panelists will talk about, which was implemented in 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It actually did 2 things, 2 interesting things. It kind of reframed or examined very critically one of the most dominant forms of recovery that happens in disaster context. But while it did the reframing job, it also critically examined a lot of evidence. It collected a lot of evidence. It co-produced evidence with communities. It examined evidence in the light of new knowledge that is emerging. So it's kind of I would say, and I am not very shy in claiming this, that it's kind of, it has the potential, or it is some kind of a Bible of knowledge at this moment. So, and I'm very happy that this happened. I have been like a part of this project for many years. I've also made some small contributions, but this has been led by 3 wonderful people who are here on the panel who will be talking about the book. So essentially how the project and the book gets connected is like, okay, disaster happens. There's a recovery process that follows disaster context or disaster situations, but the outcomes have not been very good. And that's the big question. Largely, while there may be a situation where you are you're basically eliminating loss of life situation, but that's not the only thing. You have to think about the economic life of people. We have to also think about assimilation and integration into societal frames. We have to also talk about planning and institutional arrangements underlying these processes, with the ultimate goal that, okay, well-being improves, people get better lives, their lives are not significantly disrupted, and the recovery process is robust and has significant benefits rather than costs. The experience, at least the empirical experience, states that it's not too rosy a picture. There are a lot of complexities, and I'll let the authors talk about. But there's also a very important provocation and a very important propositional starting points, which are about how do we ensure that the well-being is improved, it sustains, there's no loss of economic activity, or the economic life is not disrupted, the social life is not disrupted. And there is a mechanism that has been identified. And one of the ways in which, and if you put it, there is a recovery which happens in post-disaster situations, but there's also the aspect of how do we ensure that the recovery is just, it is fair. People who are most vulnerable, people who have suffered the most, are able to recover robustly. And the book, and this is a wider question that the Recovery with Dignity kind of project investigates. It attempts to understand that what are the mechanisms and processes that would enable a better alignment with outcomes. The book, interestingly, looks at a dominant form of this process, which is resettlement and relocation, compares it with the prospects of in situ, not displacing people, but basically helping them go better with disaster context, and attempts to identify some entry points from a public policy perspective, that how should we think about governance, institution, decision-making, implementation in the context of two questions. One is that even if there is a desirability of resettling and relocating people, it should be as less disruptive as possible. And B, if it is a question of looking at upgrading the existing systems, how should we think about that? So that's the long and short of this book, and about the project, and how are the two linked. And before I move on, it's important for me to introduce the panelists here. So we have Cassidy Johnson. She's a professor of urbanism and disaster risk reduction at Bartlett Development Planning Unit at University College London. She was the principal investigator on the project Reducing Relocation Risk in Urban Areas. That's at the back of this book. Her academic interests are very interesting and very wide. She's linked by a commitment to improving the quality of life and livelihoods of low-income groups living in urban areas in the Global South. She is also a co-editor of this book. Welcome, Cassidy. Thank you for being a part of this book as well as this panel. Next is Garima Jain, who is my colleague at Indian Institute for Human Settlements. She was also part of that project, Reducing Relocation Risk in Urban Areas. She was the co-PI on that project. Her research and practice lies at the interface of development, climate, and disaster risks. And her most recent work digs deeper into the issues of disaster recovery. And she has an explicit interest and focus on housing, land, and infrastructure development policies and narratives. And she's also an editor of this book, co-editor, of course. Thanks, Garima, for putting this book together, being part of this project, of which I was also a part, and thank you for being here. Next is Allan Lavell. I think whosoever works on disaster recovery and related things, people should know about Allan Lavell. Someday I'll run a quiz on him. He is the intellectual sounding board. I think he has made some fascinating and very important contributions to the theory and practice of disaster risk reduction as we understand it today. I was very privileged to be working with him. He has been connected with us as an institution over a long period of time. But he's always been that intellectual sounding board, very strong, robust, and always playing the devil's advocate. So what? So what? So what? So thank you, Allan, for helping us to be a part of this journey together with you. helping us learn and grow with you, and also being a part of this book, which is very interesting in many ways. So thank you so much on many counts. I'll not do a formal introduction of someone like Allan Lavell. People should go and find out if they don't know about him. Thanks, Allan. We have Emily Wilkinson also joining us. And there's a very interesting backstory to in the context of Emily. She was basically part of, she's not just contributed to the research and the book, but actually the part of the team that designed the call, based on which we did this project and then this book. And we thought that it would be interesting to talk to her about motives behind why a call was designed in a particular way, why this project was an attractive proposition, etc. But Emily herself has been a very active contributor in this space for many years. She's a senior research fellow in with Overseas Development Institute's Risk and Resilience Program, and she's also a knowledge exchange fellow of the Global Risks and Resilience Program. So thank you, Emily, for being part of this book, behind the scenes, making this book happen, designing a call in a particular way that we were able to write a nice, decent proposal. All of it, we'll be picking your brains on all of this retrospectively. So thank you for being here today. So, so what I'll do is basically, I'll start with the session now. And what we'll do is, I don't know who is timekeeping. I don't know what the format of Q&A is. Are we collecting questions? Are we? But what we'll do is that we'll do a round with the editors of the book, along with Emily. Once that round is done, then if there are any questions, then we can respond to those questions, and then we'll do another round, which will be something linked to this, but not exactly on the book, which will open it up, and then we'll open it further for a much longer, reasonably longer conversation and a wider conversation on things that are of common interest. So let me begin with Emily. Emily, my question to you is that you were involved with the design of this call, which eventually ended up funding the relocation risk project. Can you give us a sense of like what was the original objectives behind the research call? How are you thinking about the call, and why do you think retrospectively, of course, that the project that finally happened stood out as an important contribution in the context of the objectives with which the call was designed? Over to you, Emily.
Thank you very much, Amir, and thanks for inviting me to be on this panel as a research funder, but also I was very happy to have been invited to contribute to the book. So I guess I'm representing the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, CDKN, which funded this project. The call for research proposals was back in 2014, so I had to kind of go back and look through my notes about how we designed the call and the proposals that we received, and kind of really sort of dig back to remember exactly how it was structured. But it was part of a broader climate compatible development impact research fund, and the call was put out with 4 themes. And so this project was funded under one of those themes, but there was really, I remember at the time, a lot of kind of competition between different parts of CDKN to get particular themes into this important research call. And one of them was on robust national plans for climate compatible development. There was another component on enabling conditions for urban climate compatible development. this theme, climate-related disaster risk management and adaptation, and then a theme on water, energy, and food security nexus. So the CDKN remit and the research core sort of went across climate change mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk management themes. And so it was really very broad. And I remember we had to sort of fight very hard to get this theme in. And as with all kind of CDKN research, it was particularly important. We were looking for academic rigor, certainly, and intellectual leadership and new ideas, but also collaboration and partnerships. That was a really important criteria for selection of research projects, as well as policy impact. And so, really what was, I think, particularly special about CDKN's research portfolio and the way that we designed these calls for proposals was having this very strong link between academic research and policy impact. And under the theme of climate related disaster risk management and adaptation, one of the most important topics was on understanding and measuring the impacts of disaster risk management initiatives. At the time, and I think it's probably still the case, there is a really strong focus, particularly in policy and advocacy, around just having more disaster risk management. Really, the assumption that we just need governments to focus more on disaster risk management policies and initiatives, and perhaps less of an understanding of really which policies and areas of intervention kind of work well. And so the theme was designed, we intentionally didn't put out a theme that was focused on understanding disaster risk and measuring disaster risk, but rather on understanding the impacts of policies and initiatives that are intended to manage and reduce that risk. And so one of the themes was on relocation and resettlement policies as an area where we felt that there really was not very sort of comprehensive research, that there had been a few small studies and initiatives. But what was really excellent about the proposal that we received from this group was that it was multi-country and interdisciplinary and multi-method. So really looking at the socio and economic impacts of resettlement policies from lots of different perspectives. There is some number crunching, there's some economic analysis in it, but then there's also a lot of work looking at community perspectives and attitudes and perceptions around resettlement and relocation. So that really stood out to us and made it a kind of clear winner, really, of all the proposals that we received. And critically for CDKN, which does focus particularly on climate-related risks and policy, this topic of planned resettlement schemes is obviously growing in importance, because there are lots of planned resettlement schemes happening all around the world, or managed retreat, as it's referred to more in the global north. And this is a topic that's going to become increasingly important, that we're going to see more of these sort of initiatives actually be implemented. At the moment, there's a lot about kind of managed retreat, but it's very much just at the sort of longer term strategic planning stage. But we're going to see a lot more of it. And in fact, kind of the language and the focus on reducing physical risks is really growing in importance. And we see it even reflected in the private sector much more strongly now that there's this task force on climate related financial disclosures, this initiative whereby businesses are having to look at their exposure of their assets to climate change impacts. So there's this narrative around sort of addressing risk by moving things, whether that's, you know, people, communities, buildings, infrastructure, is certainly growing and becoming more prominent. And one thing I just wanted to say about the research project itself, and the results, and a lot of what's been written in the book, is around the sort of critical importance of understanding people's views and their goals and their mindsets in any sort of relocation or resettlement scheme. And, you know, if you kind of ignore that at your peril, really, I think the very strong conclusions of this project are that resettlement doesn't work in the sense that policymakers might want it to work, because they fail to understand how people perceive and understand and make choices about their lives, and how their location, where they're from, where they live, the relationship to it is so kind of critical, and all of that. And I mean, I think understanding that and people's agency and choice and decisions about things that affect their lives is important for all public policy decisions, but none more so than decisions around where people are going to live, moving them somewhere else. So that's that I found to be, you know, very satisfactory and kind of great findings from the project. And I think for the future, and it's highlighted in the book, that there needs to be kind of more of focus on understanding the long-term implications of relocation. It may sort of resolve a problem in the short term, but you know, over time, are people better off? Does the risk just get shifted somewhere else? And certainly more work around kind of policy and advocacy on this topic, because it still seems to me that policymakers think that the resettlement is a good solution to managing physical risk. So I'll leave it there, and just to thank the project team very much for really excellent work. And in answer to your question, Amir, I think it really did more than fulfill our expectations. So, you know, we're very happy to have supported this project. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. It was very nice to hear some good words about the project. But when we wrote this right at the start, we were very confident that we are getting to something unique. And Allan and Cassidy were always backing that. And we are really glad that we made this happen. And thank you for all the support that has been progressively provided in many ways. So, and thank you for the contributions just now. We'll come back to this later, but let me move on to Allan now. People must know that he's roughly at 3:30 in the morning in another time zone, but that has always been the case with him. But I'm very glad that he is able to participate in this because we need to listen to him and we need to learn from him. And all of us here will definitely benefit from the contributions he's going to make. So you have seen the long and short of all of this, Allan. And my question for you is that there's something unique, either conceptually or empirically or maybe theoretically, that this book is contributing to. In your view, and just detaching yourself from being a part of this process and the book, what do you think are those 2 or 3 important and significantly relevant from contemporary times context, important contributions that the book is making?
Thank you, Amir. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Allan, all good.
Okay, perfect. Well, first, let me thank very sincerely, well, the Indian Institute as an institution and the people that work in it with whom I've had the privilege of working over the last maybe 10 years and learning a great deal, both from what is being said, but how things are being done in terms of turning concept, ideas, notions into practice and change. And it's been a great privilege to work with you, Amir, with Garima, with Aromar, with Tasia, and with many others that I've had the opportunity to work with, and also with the people, all of the people who worked on this book project, and their thanks through Emily to the finances in its original state. And so I'm probably not going to be very popular at the moment in my house, as it is 3:30 or a little later in the morning in a very isolated rural area where everything can be heard, from birds to me. So I will keep this fairly short and low key. And maybe I can do that because basically Amir and Emily have brought forward in one way or another, directly or indirectly, a number of very critical elements that, if we think in terms of movement from concept to practice, which should always be the way we're thinking about concept. And I must admit that my life has been dedicated principally to conceptual development, but conceptual development that is based on the notion of concepts as stepping stones to changed practice. Then through what Amir said in the introduction, and Emily has commented in her introduction, a lot of the essence of the conceptual approach, the conceptual findings, the conceptual searchings, which are in this book and as a collective good, come out. And I'm going to be very short and simple on this, because in the end, when you look for concepts and you understand that the problem is complex as such and involves a whole series of different topics, approaches, from land rent considerations through to urban planning considerations, through to environmental management considerations, to human welfare, etc. And a number of concepts that are in there will be enormous. And the ability to transmit them and transfer them into a knowledge basis and therefore on into practice is also enormous. And here I think it really is important, the thing we just discussed prior to starting this meeting, what is the role of education, of research, of teaching, of ways of research and ways of teaching in fact, transforming concepts into change realities. And there, I think we should once again establish the point that this topic will get increasingly important. The idea of people being moved from one place to another with what they have and searching to re-establish a new life, and all the discussions on climate change and climate change migration, climate change movement is probably going to make sure that something that has been a historical process, and the history of humanity is probably built around settlement and movement and the movement of frontiers, of boundaries, etc., that this is going to get considerably more important. And we know and recognize from the past, and this has been said previously, that most of the efforts have not been very successful. Consequently, there is probably a disjunctive between either a badly conceived concept, and I'm sorry for the redundancy in that statement, or a concept that has not been able to be put into practice because of those that have to put it into practice are not really clearly understanding what this is all about, or do not want to understand, or have ulterior motives. And so concepts can be diverted from an effective state and statement due to the intervention of social actors that have other interests in play. And we know effectively that with this topic, what has been put forward under the guise of human resettlement for the good and the reduction of risk has in fact been incentivated by other motivations. I'm not going into the details of that. I think that comes out from the book, etc. And so, talking in that sort of around the block way, what would one see as being the absolutely critical message, which I think think is coming through. And I think that is that, the notion of resettlement must be constructed as an extension of a notion of settlement, that it must be distinguished, although it may include notions of relocation. In Spanish, we talk about reubication, reubicación, and other words which have been used interchangeably, but clearly are not interchangeably. Settlement and resettlement have a very clear matrix of integral, holistic, welfare and livelihood-based, plus a whole series of other aspects which relate to the integratedness of a social and natural environment in such a way that people can live in adequate ways, to put it that way. And this basically means that all resettlement efforts must have a basis in guaranteeing that people, once moved, are living in conditions of lower risk than they were, and therefore in conditions of greater opportunity, or at least equal, but one would hope it was greater than what existed previously. And that means the ability to have work, to have income, to have community, to have life, to have relationships, etc. So basically, whatever concept is put forward, and I think this is the idea in many of the writings in the book, is to put forward that basically the notion of resettlement has been sidelined, in the sense that it has been partially considered according to different actors' interests and interpretations of what this is all about. And so the basic conceptual question is, how can we put forward, argue for, discuss, get into the mindsets of decision makers, a view of resettlement which is integral and holistic, which looks to reduce overall risk in society. And that means not only disaster risk, if that is the motivation of movement, it means reducing everyday risk, which is the lack of opportunity to be in touch with a real life, which gives you rewards to the extent that they are required for a person to be basically happy or fulfilled or prosperous, etc. And when we take that as the starting point and we look back at the history of the development and we look at the use of words and concepts in literature, one realizes that relocation, reubication, resettlement are many times interchanged, exchanged in a sort of, not a flippant way, but not a completely convincing way. And so going back to sort of the roots of what I've been over the last 50 years with research, which has been the notion that there is no good practice without a good concept. Yeah, I really believe that the basic thing in this book, the basic message coming through, because of the evidence of failed cases, empirical study of the past has shown us that things are partially considered. But that partial consideration is not forgetfulness many times. It is more related to the fact that there are other interests, or there are short-term interests, or there are partial interests in play. That combined with the magnitude of problems which exist, and therefore the financial resources required for it, does in fact make this a very difficult task. And maybe with that, I will stop this. I will finish with my intervention that basically we're thinking of resettlement as opposed to original settlement. And there's the big problem, that the cost of resettlement, that is moving people that are already in one place to another place, to just put it in a simple way, is excessive. And it's as excessive as is the attempt on the part of society to reduce existing risk in society because of badly built schools, badly built hospitals, badly located places, that when you have to correct that through investment today, people sideline it because it's just too costly. Consequently, the other conceptual and the last conceptual one, how can we move from a notion of resettlement to adequate first settlement? Consequently, with the settlement in cities, which has been informal, has been spontaneous, has been organized, at least spontaneous, over the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years, if not more. How can we move from that into a more planned and thought out existence for the city in the future? Consequently, I would just raise the 2 points. One, that how do we get to this more holistic, integral, environmental-based understanding of resettlement? And secondly, how can we move effectively from having to correct problems that have been created to avoiding problems in the future through what we're calling prospective management. So I'll finish there so as not to exceed the 7 or 10 minutes time we had and pass back to Amir. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Allan. And that was very useful, I think, definitely for me, but I think all of us who are on the call, to at least get the essence and the core of what collectively we tried to address through this project, and we have been continuing to address through all the work that we have been doing in the past and now. So I'll move on, and I'll now go to Cassidy, and I think there'll be many listening into this conversation who may not have yet had the opportunity to go through the book. It's important to talk about in very clear terms that, okay, what can one expect if one wants to read the book? So I know that the book has 5 distinct parts, and those are connected. There's a logic behind how those parts were created. There's an underlying thesis. And I'll now hand it over to Cassidy to give us like a very short summary of what can we expect from this book? What is there in this book?
Thanks, Amir. And yeah, just to, first of all, before I do that, a big thank you to IHS for organizing this lovely book launch, and also to the collaboration over the years. I think this has really been a exciting project to work on with the team at IHS, with Allan, Lavell, and also with Emily, who played quite an integral part in the project in terms of, she gave us a lot of feedback along the way and has been quite integral to the project. So it's very nice that Emily's here with us today too. And yeah, so the book is available. I don't know if, Amir, if you said that it's an open access book, so anyone, you can go and download it now from the UCL Press website, and it's free. So please go ahead. And so the idea of the book was to bring together all of the different things that had happened in the project, and to kind of look at the problematic of resettlement and relocation in the context of disaster risk and climate change more broadly. And what we wanted to do in the book was to understand better the challenges associated with the outcomes of these resettlement and relocation interventions, and what are the outcomes on people who are affected by them and on cities. And so what we tried to do here was to examine the ways forward for avoiding the need for resettlement, and point out ways for undertaking resettlement and relocation in more holistic and integrated ways. I think my interest in this project, actually, and in doing work in this, was long before I saw the call, because I remember a number of years ago, probably around 2009 or before that even, I was very interested in this topic of, resettlement and relocation being used as a way to manage disaster risks. And it seemed to be throughout the world becoming more and more common as a way to say, well, people are living in areas that are at risk, so we need to move them from those areas. And it was kind of a knee-jerk reaction in cities across the world, and it seemed to be becoming more and more apparent. So when we saw this call, I was really quite keen to do research on this area. So I'm quite happy that we've managed to put together this book to bring together some of the findings from that. So the book is organized, as Amir said, around 5 parts. For the first one frames the issues, the sort of conceptual elements, and I think critically reframes resettlement as a last resort approach, as Allan was saying. And this has chapters by Allan and Chardin and Garima Jain. The second part of the book is about understanding and interpreting risk. So here it scrutinizes the interpretation of the subjective concept of risk, and it tries to shed light on how communities and residents might tolerate risks as a trade-off for other benefits that they value about a location. That has a chapter that's by myself, Garima and Vinitha, and we have other authors. Emily's chapter is also in there, and a chapter with Amir Schwab-Loasa, which looks at different ways of valuing risk and resettlement, which is an interesting sort of methodology for a chapter. The third part of the book looks at the issue of protest and power and resistance to resettlement. So it's interested in how urban communities are resisting and protesting against being resettled. It looks at forms of resistance for this, and I think, you know, we have 2 chapters in this section. One by Anthony Oliver Smith, who's a well-known academic who's looked at these issues for a number of years, and also one of the advisors on this project, and Angel Chavez, who was looking at in the Amazon area and looking at how people are trying to deal with the complexities of being offered resettlement, what that means for them, and how some people may be resisting that. The fourth part of the book is on on land issues in resettlement, and looking at how land is held and transactions, issues of evictions and dispossession are key themes. We have chapters by Yves Caban, Colin Marks, who's my colleague, Giovanna Astolfo, who's also my colleague at UCL, and Bill Flynn, who's I think on this call today. And I think that land is such a key issue in this topic, both for why people are forced to settle on areas that might be affected by landslides or floods, because, you know, it's the only available land or the most affordable land, and also issues about the legality of why certain people might be easy to move or forced to move off places, and also the way that land is held and how this actually impacts on whether resettlement can take place or not, which is something that we found in Kampala. And these complexities and layers of land tenure rights make it quite difficult to actually do resettlement, which is interesting. And the fifth part of the book, we explore the thing of natural resource and human occupation issues. So this juxtaposition between people living on lands that are also could be important natural resources, could be watersheds or ecological reserves, and these kind of contradictions between the desired development and the required conservation. So those are the 5 parts of the book. And maybe I'll leave it at that, Amir. And I also have some notes. I can go through the different sort of the main conclusions of the book if we have time in this session.
Thanks, Cassidy. It was a very nice short introduction. I think I have a feeling that people will be attracted to this. On the chat, there's a link that has been pasted now for the open. People can visit that link and download the open access book. I think it's a fascinating book and everyone should get a copy of this, at least read it. Now I'll move on to Garima Jain, who's also a co-editor, who was also a co-I on the project, reducing relocation risk. So my question for her, are two ways. So there, one is she could briefly talk about the work that was done as a part of this project in India. Just an introductory thing. People may find connections. People may find it useful. And what was done in the Indian context. A very brief introduction. And the second is basically coming to the starting point of this project. Like, there were some high-level questions. The questions were related to outcomes of resettlement and relocation processes or interventions, and there was an assessment of the underlying structures and processes and mechanisms that was delivering that. So if we go back to the question, I'll ask Garima to reflect on the question itself and tell us and tell the audiences also that has the work ended? Do we have enough to know to think about intervening without worrying too much about this is not going to work, or do we need to do some more? And if we need to do some more work, what are those 2 or 3 avenues that you would like to highlight, which would be useful for people researching on these things or engaging with these questions at multiple scales? Over to you.
Thank you, Amir, for that pretty intense question. And of course, thank you also to Cassidy, Allan, Emily, and all the other authors who actually also, some of them who've taken the time to be part on this panel today, despite sort of strange time zones and circumstances in general that we are all in these last couple of months. So to your question, Amir, the first part, how it was, just from the Indian part of this project. When we started this conversation, Cassidy, Allan, and myself, when we started this conversation of putting together the brief or the proposal even, I very clearly recall that, by then we had, honestly, we just knew about very few of such projects going on at that time. As in terms of very specific projects. So we thought it would be nice to kind of take a look at those and in what ways are, they are being implemented, what kinds of outcomes they have, and so on. But then I think in a few months, we knew it was basically a rabbit hole, because everywhere we looked, there was just so much going on. There was just like so many of these interventions taking shape in different states and in different forms. And honestly, I mean, of course, this itself was in 2015 to 2018, but then from here, there were lots of other offshoots of different projects that we ended up doing, which looked specifically at different states and different settlements, and from a slightly different perspective. In fact, Teja and Chandni are also on the call with them. We also did another project looking at Chennai specifically, and in fact, one of the chapters in this book also is derived from some of the findings from that project, in fact. But I think what these years of research have at least made us aware, and rather acutely aware, is that we have only scratched the surface of this big issue. The cases we gathered and studied in aggregate across all these different continents, I can say for, broadly, will potentially account for about 500,000 resettled people or thereabouts. and yet we are aware at the same time that it is merely represents sort of a minuscule proportion of the actual number of people facing displacement in the form of resettlement across different regions, not just global south, but also global north. And as Emily said, in the form of what's called managed retreat elsewhere. So there's an important and urgent need, I feel, that a need to collate and assess what this actual scale is, because I think partly the fact that we don't understand how big the issue is, there are not there are not as many studies that are going on, which there should be on this area. I mean, having said that, I also know that there are some studies going on. There's some very keen interest from different parts. Stanford University, for instance, has been doing a lot of research on this. And but what is really required is that, you know, people and researchers from different interdisciplinary backgrounds who can employ more innovative methods to sort of come together to be able to do this, considering resettlement, as we have talked about in this book also, and as Allan also spoke a little bit earlier in this session, is that it comes in many different forms. It's both post-disaster, it is also preventative, but also, as we know, that even in the pretext of risk reduction, that takes different forms of in many ways. So to actually have a sense of what that typology of resettlement is and what scales those are in, and distinguishing between the urban aspects versus the rural variations of within this form of typology, I think would be very important to study. And I would really be keen to see more research coming out in this in that space over the years. Secondly, I think I would say from a more policy kind of perspective. So we know that there is, and you know, nowhere certainly not just this project, but also there are others who have done a whole lot in this field from before. There's plenty of evidence by now, not just, of course, you know, from a risk perspective, but also from development point of view, that resettlement of people from, you know, places they have inhabited for long have almost always resulted in long-term socioeconomic and environmental, tangible and intangible costs for people and places. And yet resettlement remains a dominant approach for recovery. We heard about this even yesterday, where, you know, when we talk about recovery, it's almost synonymously used with the idea of reconstruction and resettlement. And while there have been big advances made in, let's say, preparedness, early warning systems, response mechanisms, but recovery as such is still quite limited to these areas. And this is largely because of, and what we found at least also, is that it's quite a lot because of the limited nature of coherent policies in the global south that tend to focus on recovery as such, where they tend to rely a lot more on resettlement and relocation policies that have been instated in the context of development induced resettlement processes, and do not account for conditions of risks and vulnerabilities. That's also partly because I think the other reason for this is that, you know, and this is something that we've also found in the Recovery with Dignity project, that there are the losses to housing are often the most tangible and most visible and attract the most attention from recovery actors. But the ongoing vulnerabilities and the drivers of vulnerabilities and exposure that sort of may have created the risks in the first place do not get really addressed by just the provision of shelter. And as we talk about in the book, that shelter per se is not necessarily equivalent to housing also, because housing also has the aspects of viability, has the aspect of affordability, equity, and so on, which also need to be addressed when we talk about housing. So there is a sheer need, I would say, for developing a comprehensive recovery policy, which is in line with a sort of long-term view of outcomes, alongside a strong monitoring mechanism to ensure the objectives set out for risk reduction, and a holistic recovery in a way that, you know, that there are, as we know, that, you know, a recovery process will require different kinds of line ministries, different kind of sectoral approaches, but at the end of it, there has to be some kind of an overarching, holistic, outcome-based view to recovery, which addresses many of the issues. And of course, if within that it is understood and it's assessed clearly that resettlement is indeed the last resort, that's the only time when it should be undertaken, instead of that being the first and the only solution, which is what we have found. And one recognition, I think, connected to these ideas is that, that both research and practice possibly need to make, I think, is that disasters are probably not, they shouldn't be seen as an event, but a process. It is only by shifting, sort of making that shift between that we'll actually accept that risks are indeed socially generated, the fact that they are systemic and they're often not linear, where new forms and new risks emerge over time with different intensities even, and including with sort of different interventions made, as we've seen in this research, is that post resettlement also there are new kinds of socioeconomic risks that have been generated and costs being generated for people. So, and the best way and the best people really to know and understand this continuum are those that live with it. So unless there's an active understanding that that they need to letting them be the owners of their risk reduction and recovery decisions is, I would say, not just important, but practically the only way. And that is the only way to enable what we are calling, I would say, recovery with dignity in some way. So in the book, we also, I think, do point out towards the end, some different directions for research that research can take. We've seen that literature, there is some literature that exists about place attachment, for instance, and the role that place attachment plays in terms of people's decision making and their relationship with the environment, with the place, and that tends to lead to some sort of resistance. But there's very little studied in the context of the global South in this, where the limited ability for people to act further affects the choices available for them for coping or adaptation. So that kind of a mediation in this context also needs to be studied further. The other aspect is the idea of urban, within the urban context, that the recognition that urban areas are extremely dynamic, and the vulnerabilities within them and the exposures are also constantly changing, especially of course due to climate change and growing populations and the changing society and social structures, and they also face unique challenges such as those owing to land pressures and stated difficulties in participatory processes, etc. But also the politics of larger variety of stakeholders that exist. So there is a need to further study and delve into and arrive at alternatives, for reasonable alternatives actually, for processes for resettlement and relocation. I think, in that sense, of course, there are a whole bunch of other things that need to be done. Land tenure are very integral part of this area that needs again more attention. But then I think in one of the things that is most difficult to do is to understand the long-term outcomes, and for that more research inputs, more studies that can be done on longitudinal longitudinal studies to understand long-term implications on people because of such interventions that need to come up to help policy and practice. So I think I would just leave it at that. Amir, back to you.
Yes, thank you for summarizing it so well. I handed it over to you to talk about the work which we did in India, and you did a very good job with it. So thanks, Garima. Thanks for everything. Thanks for putting this book together, working with Cassidy and Allan, and giving us this gem. I think this is going to be a very important document for years to come. So what I'll do here is now is basically do a little bit of very quick my reflection, because I was involved in this project right from the beginning, and I also have been thinking through this has been happening since 2014, and now is 2021. There's a lot of thinking, a lot of ideas that have been germinating in my mind and collectively, and there's some thoughts that I'd like to share. After that, I see there are a couple of questions, so I'll ask those questions. If everyone agrees, then I can identify a person to answer that, just in the interest of time, and then we can go to another round of discussion where I have something very concrete to talk about, which will be of interest to everyone of us here. And then we can open it further and see if there are any questions that exist. So as far as I think I am concerned, particularly in the context of this project and in the context of the kind of work which we did, two things kind of stood out very clearly for me. And because I was involved partly in those aspects, that kind of intellectual work, but also because I find them to be very, very relevant, and which has been very rightly pointed out by Emily early on when she intervened and gave her opening remarks. The first question that has always been like troubling me, it continues to haunt me, not from this context of this project, but also in general, is this idea of the scale of analysis. I think when we think about an intervention, it is located in one place. It's affecting a set of people, affecting some systems, but it is located in something happening at a much wider scale, a much broader scale, and book is trying to converge that into, okay, what is this coherence that we are arguing for? How do we build that coherence? I think that's a very important aspect, because people movement, resource movement, systems, they're connected. We have geopolitics, we have complex administrative and political regimes within country. So it's cutting across administrative, something uniquely different and something very complex is happening at a much bigger scale. And this is an outcome of that. I think pushing back and making sense of that complex transition is important to locate this question of resettlement and relocation within. The second aspect, which I feel we made some progress, there's a lot still to be done, is on, and there's a chapter there, there's a section there, that how do we measure outcomes? How do we make sense of outcomes? And there have been a lot of experiments people have engaged with. And I think every experiment is valid. The question of what is value, which Emily brought in early, is very important. It was attested in this project, and from whose perspective? As the poster of this this book launch states, that okay, which is the dominant perspective, and what is institutionalizing that dominant perspective? So that is still a work in progress question, in my opinion. And I think we have made some progress through this project, and there's some interesting work happening around the world. And the third thing is that how do we, and this is a question that we have received from one of the co-Is of this project, and this is where I'll come back to Cassidy and Allan in particular, is this question of longer term recovery, that how do we make the recovery processes robust and strong, fair, equitable, and how do we institutionalize that? I think that is still an important question. I just wanted to touch upon a few things that I found relevant in contemporary context, particularly from similar, if not exactly similar work that I have been doing in other sectors, which is this idea of commercial versus social returns. And I think there's money available, but there's a manner in which value for money is quantified. How do we kind of ensure that we make a clear distinction, and we operationalize that distinction, and we hardwire it into guidance notes of, say, financing institutions, etc. There's the market valuation, which is given dominance, but social valuation is not given dominance. And this is a long story, a long fight from the ecosystem services phase, early 2000, where we are trying to get some synergies between these two contexts. And the other challenge that I find is, and this is something that the Recovery with Dignity project is looked at. This is something that we looked at in our project, and this book expands on. How do we kind of codify justice concerns, justice issues into institutional mechanisms, processes, and structures? And I am currently looking at that. How do we codify this into the decisions of development finance institutions, so that this is not something considered as a peripheral outcome, but something which is a dominant goal to kind of chase. So I'll stop here after making some of these weird comments, but I'll now come back to a very important question that Mark Tebbett raises, and I'll first go to Allan, and then I'll go to Cassidy. It's a very interesting question, and he says that given the situation that we end up with resettling people or relocating people, and if that is the only option, what is the best chance that we have, and in what ways, so that we can ensure that people can move but with dignity, and it really leads to genuine recovery. So outcomes are not like very peripheral, but they are robust, very internalized, and structurally very dominant. So if resettlement is the last option, how do we ensure that we deliver well on that? So Allan first, and then Cassidy.
Yeah, maybe I'll try and be very brief on this one, but it is, I was recently asked, just to put this in context, to give a talk on green recovery in the framework of a big meeting between European Union government and Latin American government through an organization which is set up to stimulate discussion on these things. And one of the comments I made was it seems increasingly, if we think about the financial crisis and the intermediate crises, and now the COVID crisis and what will be the next one, that all of our ideas about transforming society are based on having a crisis and then taking up that as a possibility of instituting structural change in society. And so the basic question one has is, do we really have to wait for crises in order to be able to do things better? Or should we be thinking, and this links into one of the major areas one's been working on and thinking about how to get to it, which is the notion of not corrective stuff, but prospective stuff. And I know that's extremely difficult, but I don't think there is any alternative. I don't think solutions that try to correct things like resettlement from hazard-prone areas are very likely to be successful on a massive scale. They may be, and there are very clear examples of most things which are successful as done on a pilot basis or a small scale basis or an isolated basis, etc. But as a general policy framework, most corrective things, unless they are very clearly structural in the sense of retrofitting a hospital or relocating a hospital from a hazard-prone area where you can definitely see the kickback in terms of reduced risk. Most of these more integral, complex things seem to escape the logic of logic. And consequently, I don't see too much alternative. And I'm not going to say I'm not going to answer the question, but I would much prefer to ask the question of how can we, through different methods, ideas, approaches, forms of relationship with the actors of society in general, move to a situation where structural, more complex structural change. I'm sorry, that's a early morning cough, can be actually put on board. And consequently, one's been arguing for years that, we can, the dominance of reactive and corrective approaches, and because of the apparent kickback to them in many terms, economic, political, etc., eliminate in some way, in commas, the possibility of prospective thought. Prospective thought is just too complex to get on top of and to undertake. And so I'm not answering the question. And if I had to answer a question, then it would be through changes in the methods and processes. And that's saying everything in a very simple phrase. And the whole thing about co-production, of participation, of accountability, all of these things, human rights approaches, all become relevant generally and specifically to many of the contexts we're dealing with. And without that, we're not going anywhere. Consequently, what we get to, and I think with Garima, she was part of this process of discussion we had in doing a recent project for UNDP on governance for the 21st century. What we're not talking about, we're not talking about governance for disaster risk management in a prospective fashion, or we're not talking about governance for systemic risk. Basically, we're talking about governance. That is the governance which is prevalent in a country and which deductively will lead to different ways of dealing with a whole sum of problems that don't seem to be related, that are related. Consequently, I think we have to move towards an overall view of improved governance, but don't partialize it, specializing it, etc. Although later you have to do that. But there are some basic principles involved in resolving society's problem. It doesn't matter whether it's relocation, resettlement, risk reduction, poverty reduction, or whatever. They all have very similar bases. And I think if COVID has shown us anything, luckily, which we've been trying to show for many years, is underlying vulnerabilities and exposures are the same. Doesn't matter what the crisis event is. That is, doesn't matter if it's a financial crisis or it's COVID or it's an earthquake or the underlying vulnerability factors will affect very similar people every time. And so with governance, the whole same principle moves. Well, anyway, I won't take up any more time because I know it's short and I probably haven't answered a question, but at least I've had an early 5 o'clock in the morning thought process.
No. It was your provocation was very useful because it kind of puts us on a thinking path, and everyone to think about and this point about COVID and making these things quite visible and starkly visible in contemporary times that these exist, and you can't be waiting for a crisis to show this. You have to be proactive. So thanks, Allan. Cassidy, your thoughts on this?
I mean, I think Allan's point, which I'd say we discussed a lot during the project, and I absolutely agree with him that this problem of resettlement is actually, it's as he says, it's a palliative response to things, to people living in places that are frankly not very suitable or not very dignified. So so I think that it's those prospective risk things that we need to look at. So I very much agree with that. I might go a bit further and answer the question in that we've discussed a lot in this project, resettlement versus relocation. And and I would say that I can't really say how resettlement, which would be, the resettling, the movement of wholesale movement of people, communities to new places. I mean, unless you're going to follow sort of the existing guidelines on how resettlement should be undertaken, which the guidelines exist, however, they're often not put into practice very well. So improving those practices. But I think, which is also something we discussed in the project, but I think that the issue is really around this relocation versus resettlement. And I think probably the most successful incidences or cases of this is when communities have made a collective decision to relocate themselves. And usually, so one is around who decides and how those decisions are made. And these sort of top-down policy approaches tend to be very negative for people. So if there's a community that comes together and decides to move. And also the difference between relocation and resettlement, I think, is really key, because relocation is about moving perhaps your house, but all of those other aspects of habitat, which we discuss in the book, are also there, because if you move to an area that's 1 kilometer away, you still have access to many of the things that you already had access to. And I think that that's a really, really big part of it, which is how far do people have to move? And are people maintaining those existing social networks, financial networks, and all of those things that make life.
Yeah, thanks, Cassidy. That was like a very precise and very, very important. I think that was a useful and a very important, that's a very useful way in which we can think about long-term recovery. Thinking about distance as a marker and how access to resources are still intact. I think we have very little time left, and I don't see any specific questions from the audience, but I wanted to take this opportunity to pick all of your brains on something that we have been thinking about of late, and we feel that this will be an important area for future work and discussion, etc. And I was thinking about, so there is a situation, and there are outcomes that we are not very happy about, and there are people who are either in decision-making places or are working in institutions that work with communities, etc. And these people are coming to a higher education system or an education system that is empowering them in some ways to respond very carefully and also adequately to the situation on ground. So if we kind of push back and see that, okay, and many of us are here on the panel are engaged in teaching and academic work, in curriculum development, pedagogy, etc. So if we are thinking about ensuring that there is significantly trained and adequately trained human capacity available to respond to these situations in a fair and just manner, is there an opportunity, or are there some experiments available which helps us to relook at the higher education system? Are there some green shoots emerging from somewhere around the world, from any kind of experimental domain, be it pedagogy, be it curriculum, be it courses, be it capacity building initiatives that has hope for institutionalizing it into higher education systems around the world? And do we see that as a very interesting option to explore in order to respond to not so good job that we have been able to do on the ground in terms of improving outcomes? So I know, because I know about, because of my, I have some prior knowledge about Emily doing something about in this space. So I'll come to Emily first, and then I'll go to Cassidy because she's very interestingly located in the process. And then I'll come to Allan to think about practice, from a practice orientation, that how do we think about education from a very practice and a policy orientation? And then I'll come to Garima in the end from her reflections, because she has also been on the front lines of experimenting with certain innovative ways of engaging with place and people. So she can make some comments on that.
Thanks, Amir. I'll be very brief. I mean, just to Alan's point about focusing more on the kind of prospective work, I think there's a really critical role for planning professionals, people working in planning agencies, because that's exactly what their job is. You know, they do strategic planning, they think about the future, and working with the regulatory agencies, trying to sort of set the incentives and like shaping the market, and that's discussed in the book a bit in terms of kind of appropriate land and access to it and so on. So I'm very happy to be working with the University of Technology in Jamaica on developing a curriculum for urban planners in the Caribbean on resilient cities, which could very easily incorporate a lot of the ideas that have been produced and discussed during this project. And I think that that's a really kind of critical entry point. So this is for planning professionals, mid-career professionals. I mean, it could be extended to sort of graduate program as well. But I think, you know, people already in planning roles are the ones who are less likely to have considered these concepts and have been trained in a lot of these issues when they were at university. So I think that's a very kind of exciting project, and I'd like to see more of those sort of initiatives.
Cassidy?
Yeah, I think that, so I teach master's and PhD program in the UK, and we teach students from all over the world who come to the development planning unit at UCL to learn about the different programs we have, such as we have one on urban development planning, environment and sustainable development, one for architects on building and urban design. And I teach two modules, one that's on in those programs that are like optional, so students from across the department and in the university take them. And one is on disaster risk reduction in cities, so looking really at that preemptive role. We used to teach more mid-career professionals, as you're talking about, Emily, who used to work in municipal government, national government, and would come and do a year in London, sort of learning more about these issues. However, I think it's more and more towards the younger age of people coming with a little bit of professional experience, but most of their career is still ahead of them. And then I also teach a module that's on post-disaster recovery. And I think still for a lot of students, this kind of knee-jerk reaction is often, well, if people live in areas that are, they're exposed to hazards on a regular basis or large disasters, that people need to be moved from there. And it is still kind of this knee-jerk reaction. And so we always I think what we've done in this project and things have been quite useful in terms of, we do talk about what are some of those impacts of people being moved, and how it usually, the outcomes are quite negative. But I think that more and more this kind of social or environmental justice lens, which is a lot of what we teach, is looking at, how do different initiatives impact on people's rights and on their well-being. And so I think when you start to look at this problem from those perspectives, and you analyze it from, what are actually the outcomes for people, it starts to become actually quite easy to see that resettlement is not really the answer, and that other things need to be looked at. So what we try to teach is around looking at that critical lens of that. So I hope that it's less practical. I agree with Emily's, this training for mid-career professionals, and especially on disaster risk and planning, because disaster risk is often not something that is always very integral in planning schools. And so I think this is really quite a critical thing also.
Thanks, Cassidy. Allan, I just wanted to reframe it for you. I just thought that being in this space for so long and for so many years, I'd like you to just think about a young individual in a university studying something which has a very disciplinary orientation, has the potential of, or is thinking about a career in disaster resilience. What would you expect that person to be aware of? And how do you, from the perspective of what is happening on the ground, what would be your recommendations for that university system to basically teach and to train that young individual?
Yeah, you changed the question. Okay. Well, very briefly, I must admit that I've had the disadvantage of being out of what I would call formal teaching for some time due to age, and also I just got too involved in other things. But there are two things that are absolutely critical to me, and they do not resolve a problem, but without them, there is no way of resolving the problem. One is this whole notion of what we've been talking about for years and still don't get right, which is inter-transdisciplinary approaches in the university curriculum, in research, in teaching, etc. And the other is this the need for a very strong conceptual base. I got tired over the years of being told by many people when I gave talks that one was too conceptual. And in the end, the response to that was always what Einstein said about good practice and theory. But that doesn't work, but it doesn't get through to a lot of people. But what I did discover over the years was, without that strong and reasonable, to put it that way, conceptual framework, there is nowhere to go. And I was really impressed, actually, I must admit, in Latin America with a project called Rethinking, which was a European Union finance project for the Andean community, where I was employed for 3 years giving conceptual courses. And I wasn't doing it because Rethinking decided they wanted it. I was doing it because the government asked for it. Now, from that, we in fact, and this is just an anecdote, we've probably got in Latin America some of the best disaster risk management laws in the world. You look at the Colombian, or you look at the Uruguayan, etc. They're among the most advanced conceptions, but very few of them, and obviously this is not an absolute statement, work. And so that transition from concept to practice, that last mile that people talk about, is just not happening. So the basic other question in education is how you can bring in some notion of transitions between understanding a problem and transforming a problem, which means moving from concept to practice, whatever way you wish to express that relationship. And that will never happen unless there is a thorough integration of history, of an understanding of transition, of process, of change. If there is not an integration of actors, that is, that people in universities have the chance to understand why status quo, why old mind thought, why historical ideas on things still persist and lead to government administration still doing things which today, on a more advanced conception of things, would be considered to be erroneous, but carry on despite insistent criticism. And so I think the whole educational process has to be integrative in all senses of the word. It has to flow out from a university to the world around you. It has to flow from that world into you. It has to have the strongest conceptual base, which is not necessarily indoctrination, but at least to offer the opportunity to understand the different views that are taken of the world and the transitions needed in practice to get to that, have that on the ground. And so, I think if I take it from my own experience, if one says one has had success, and I'm not sure how much success we've all had, that success would have been related to communication. It is the idea of being able to talk to people on the levels in which people can understand what you're talking about. And so it's bringing language to an accessible form to the relevant actors you're dealing with. So I think from a university perspective, you could internalize that idea into practice. But holism, integratedness, transdisciplinarity, and a sound conceptual basis are absolute fundamentals. Without that, you're not going to go anywhere. Not necessarily with it will you go anywhere, but at least there's a good chance you could move somewhere beyond where we are many times today.
Thanks, Allan. That superbly framed answer and a lot of food for thought. We just have a couple of minutes here, so I'll ask a very pointed question to Garima. Garima, I know her personally so many years now, and I've always found her to be motivated by and excited only by field component of research. So she's like super happy if she's on the field, etc. So Garima, tell me from some of your experience. She has been teaching, she has been running programs, and she has a lot of experience dealing with training and teaching aspects. How important it is to be on the field and to integrate field perspectives into classroom learning.
Thanks, Amir, for putting me on the spot on that one. But yeah, absolutely. I think there is it's not just about getting away from fieldwork, but I think that's just where the learning starts, honestly. I think it's also, it's not just about actually going to the field, but it's really about just not going with any biases. I think that's the most important part. At least I feel that you go in not assuming what you're going to find, not assuming what the field might tell you, and just letting it be. I think that's really, really key in that. And I think the other aspect also is that, and I think what has really worked for us, and it's just been completely fortunate that we've been able to go to the same places for many years now. We've been studying the same areas and same regions for about 10 years. We've managed to get funding from different sources, but we managed to study the same areas, but looking at very different questions. But I can tell you that for sure that the questions have really come from those fields. The reason why we actually pitched for new research questions has actually come from the field, because the field really required us to ask those questions. I think that was that's an important point. And I think that I'll kind of build on the earlier kind of conversations that was going on in this particular context, and connecting with a big group of professionals who who do go to field, it's media group, for instance, the journalists and the people who are capturing a lot of this information. So these are, so they do tend to go to the field, but there is a certain imagination that they tend to bring back. There is a certain kind of narrative that gets captured in mainstream media, which does not necessarily address the kinds of questions and needs that people have. In fact, what we found from the field also is that a lot of this media interest that comes after let's say immediate sort of extreme events tends to stay there for, the interest tends to stay there for 3 months, and then that's it. And often people are also disconnected with what is being written about them, so they don't even know how they are represented, because they don't have access to the what's been written, how's it been shown on television, etc. But they so they just they don't know what is being said about them, whereas what is being said about them does have implications for how it influences recovery actors, and it influences the actions that are taken thereafter on them. So there's a certain, there's a very important there's an importance right now for the media, the people who are writing in the mainstream media, to definitely take cognizance of this idea that going to the field again, and it was also referred yesterday by Kamal, who was speaking, that we tend to only write about the issues, things that are not done, but we also need to write a lot more about the long-term outcomes. We need to write about the long-term successes as well at the same time in the mainstream media, to actually capture what is working, what's not working. So I think in many ways, I would say there is a lot to learn from the field. There is a lot for for I guess, and field is also one of the places. I mean, I've also heard, and I'm reading on this, the graphic that's going on, transdisciplinary approaches and so on. I think that's field is also one place where different disciplines do come together as well. So that also makes it really important why being on the field is quite critical. And one thing that we will be talking quite a lot tomorrow in one of the sessions is this idea of this over-reliance from on technocratic kind of approaches, this over-reliance on the STEM fields, which is science-based, technology-based, engineering-based approaches, which tend to kind of take or sort of inform policy decisions, tend to inform planning decisions, and there is very little actually that importance given to other sort of social sciences, humanities, arts, and what's now being called the shape fields, which is these fields for people and economy. And there is that importance of bringing them up front to say that, and it's become quite relevant now with COVID, where we've seen that, just developing vaccines is certainly not enough unless we can actually make people or convince people behaviorally to actually take them. So it's kind of like in a nutshell to say that shape is not just also important, but sometimes even more important than STEM. So just putting it out there. So yeah, back to you, Amir. And yes, nice to see Shoaib here as well.
Yes, and I was searching for him. I didn't know he's there. Shoaib, 1 minute for you. Tell us something nice about this book, and why should people read this book?
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep my video off because of the bandwidth. Thank you, Amir, and thank you, everyone. Cassidy, Emily, Garima, and Allan, nice to be here. I can't really find one that is really striking for me, but I would say connecting it to education, that I think what this book is important for any reader, and everybody must read and even make a reference to it, and perhaps even use the concepts in there, is that it has material that will train people, future practitioners, and also guide academics and research on recovery programs. And preemptiveness approach around disaster is really very important. It speaks also very much deeply to the current thinking going on in UNDRR. And it is very important that this book is a must read to guide future practitioners on how to preemptively reduce risk. And in much more detail, the different parts as described and explained by Cassidy that touch on the framing and assessment, but also the multiple value systems and issues to do with land, that connects very much to the experiential knowledge that all of us do have from different geographies around the realities of resettlement and relocation. One thing we cannot negate, and the book is very much loudly speaking about it, is the multiple value systems and the interests of different actors in areas that are likely to be affected by resettlement and relocation, as well as the associated scenarios, one of which is voluntary relocation and resettlement. It speaks lots about the importance of people coming to the center. I also saw that a little bit in the chart. So yeah, I mean, the book is great in its entirety. And when you dive into the different parts and the different chapters, then you get really very good material that can guide the future training or the current training of practitioners in disaster risk reduction, resettlement, relocation. Just to end my submission, Amir, thank you again, is from the perspective of Uganda, where I was based on this project. There is no national resettlement policy. We didn't find one. There is only program-based, project-based, which means it's very much contextual in terms of the scope of work, and usually contextual in terms of the directly impacted area. So then you will find interventions of resettlement and relocation around urban infrastructure. You will find such in energy infrastructure, and then maybe some other, water resources infrastructure, like for example, valley dams, if you go out of urban systems. And because that is this kind of disparate, it's very important that the practitioners and this particular book can guide the formulation of national policies on resettlement and relocation. Thank you.
Thanks, Shoaib. Thanks. Lovely to have you and hear your voice. I think the organizers are like sending me messages. And the last thing that we can do is that whosoever has the book, just hold it. Let's show how the book looks. Very nice. I think Rajashi has shared this, so people are not able to see it clearly. Just hold on. Yes, Garima, you don't have the book. So this is how it looks.
I'm living out of a suitcase, so.
But it was lovely chatting with old friends, reconnecting on something that we did together. It was very nice to talk about some of the things that have come out from this book and how does it relate to the question that this project is also asking. And hopefully all of us have benefited. We'll read this book and let us get this book into curriculums around the world. I think that's a very important thing, for at least for me. So thank you all. Thank you for Garima for giving me this opportunity to go back down the memory lane. And lovely to see you all. Stay safe. We'll catch up soon. I think every day is better than the previous day now. Thanks all.
Thank you.